it's really an honor for me personally to be here with him in the same web room. Beena ji is, I've been watching her in Festig. It's the Feminist Economist Saturday discussion group. She's also an inspiration for many of us. She's a professor of development, economics, and environment at the University of Manchester at UK. Earlier, she was the director of the Institute of Economic Growth in Delhi. She's written extensively on gender inequality, land rights, agrarian change, and environmental issues. Her latest book is Gender Challenges, published by OUP, a 3-volume compendium of her selected papers. She has received multiple awards, including a Padma Shri in 2008, the Leontief Prize, and in 2017, the Louis Malassis International Scientific Prize, and the International Balzan Prize for challenging established premises in economics and the social sciences by using an innovative gender perspective. I'm so happy you wrote that, Beena ji, because really that's what we identify with you, which is challenging, established premises which have to do with gender issues, especially for India. Rinana Chapwala, Rinana Ben, to most of us, is the president of Seva Bharat, which serves as the National Federation of all Sevas with the self-employed women's associations across India. She has been with Seva since 1977 and has actively worked towards organizing millions and millions of poor women working in the informal economy as bidi workers, agricultural workers, construction workers, street vendors, and many others to bargain for higher income, better working conditions, space to work, for social security. She's presently the chair of HomeNet South Asia, and she's also one of the founding members of WIEGO. She's been active in many government committees and task forces to formulate policies for women in the informal economy. And she's written widely on these issues in journals and newspapers and has co-authored 7 books. Rinana Ben is also a Padma Shri awardee for her contributions to the field of social work in India. Santosh ji, Professor Mehrotra, is a professor of economics and chairperson at the Center for Labor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU. He has spent nearly 15 years with the UN in different research positions, including heading UNICEF's Global Research Program at the Innocenti Research Center at Florence, and as a chief economist of the Global Human Development Report. He has also headed the Rural Development and Development Policy Divisions of the Planning Commission between 2006 and 2009, and has been a lead author of several chapters in the 11th and 12th 5-year plans of India. He advises the current government of India and is a member of the Standing Committee on Economic Statistics. His recent book, Reviving, is a book called Reviving Jobs: An Agenda for Growth, which has just been published a couple of weeks ago by Penguin, which I'm really looking forward to read. It presents a charter of what it would take to revive jobs in the Indian economy now. And we are hoping he will reflect on his findings from the book, more on what matters for women when he addresses us. So if it's okay with the panelists, can I begin the session? Beena ji? I can't hear you, Beena ji. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, there's a bit of a problem. I'm trying to exit the full screen.
I see.
So, okay, it's fine.
It's fine now? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask you in the first round, Beena ji, I just want to start with you, and then we'll go to Rinana Ben and Santosh ji in that order. What do you think would be a relevant conceptual framework? I know that you've written about so many frameworks and just looking at gender issues in India. What would be a relevant conceptual framework and approach to examine women's work, especially now in the light of COVID and its impact right now? So you have 10 minutes, Beena ji, and then we'll shift to Rinana Ben.
Yeah, I just exit. Let me just exit this again.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Firstly, I warmly thank Soumya Kapoor for organizing this webinar. She has multiple hats, but she's also a key member of the Feminist Economics Saturday discussion group, FESTIG, in Delhi, which we've been running for over 5 years. And thanks to everyone who has joined from India and globally in such a challenging time. We are, of course, all interested in knowing what will be the impact of COVID-19 on women's lives and livelihoods. But the answers will be varied and complex, and the evidence so far is limited despite many ongoing rapid surveys. So it would be useful, Soumya suggested that it would be useful to think through conceptually, and it's not one framework I'm going to talk about, but a set of conceptual issues in order that we might consider what kinds of effects we should be looking for and how should we interpret what we observe. What I present will not be comprehensive, so please feel free to add to that during the Q&A. Now, we must remind ourselves that while some of the effects are due to COVID-19, most are indirect fallouts of an economically crippling lockdown, as well as of a sliding Indian economy in the pre-COVID period. So coming to Soumya's question on conceptual framing, first of all, I feel it's important to distinguish between employment/labor force participation and sustainable livelihoods. As we know, we've been very preoccupied with women's falling labor force participation rate over many years. But in my view, we need to shift away from this preoccupation only with jobs to a broader focus on livelihoods. Why? For several reasons. One, that jobs and labor force participation rates don't tell us much about earnings or incomes. So women can be employed on the family farm or family enterprise, but earn nothing independently. Or they may be working and still be poor. So the old concept of working poor might apply. By contrast, I feel that if we think of livelihoods, we think of both work and income adequacy. Secondly, a focus on livelihoods helps us to recognize that people, and especially if you're poor, often depend on multiple sources of income. So over a year, a woman can work on farms, if you're a rural woman, on Narega, on home-based work in different seasons. So this would help us to ask, with lockdowns, have they lost all the jobs in all the fronts or on some fronts, and how has that played out? The third is that livelihoods require us to focus on productive assets. So for self-employed women, livelihood security requires access to assets. In rural areas, it could be land. In cities, it could be just the four-wheel cart for ferrying your products. And we know that there are very serious pre-existing gender inequalities in asset ownership, and these could worsen with COVID-19 as households' incomes and savings get depleted. And if so, we might ask, well, whose assets will go first, or whose savings? Now, in our research on droughts and famines, including mine, we found that it was typically the women's assets which were found to go first, undermining, therefore, their future livelihoods. So this is the first conceptual point, which is the importance of focusing on livelihoods. The second conceptual need, I feel, is to shift from a focus on women workers alone to household survival strategies. So what happens to women also depends on what happens to men in a family. Hence, if a woman vendor or a farm laborer loses her job, but her husband retains his, or can find another job simply because he is more mobile, it could cushion both from poverty. But at the same time, this dependence on family men can also change intra-household dynamics by decreasing women's bargaining power. And this in turn could have other negative effects, such as her risk of domestic violence. So in our COVID-19 impact surveys, I feel we need to ask not just what is happening to women workers, but also what is happening to male earnings in the family. And some of the rapid surveys I've seen only focus on women, assuming that if she loses her job, she will fall into poverty. Possibly, but not necessarily. And also, as I said, we can expect other complex intra-household effects. Third, of course, we need to examine the riskiness of jobs. And here there's a direct effect of COVID-19, namely on mortality. Now, the UN Women in New York has globally been compiling data which shows that in most countries, female COVID mortality is lower than male. But they don't provide figures for India yet. But I do remember that in the 1918 pandemic, India was an outlier with much higher excess mortality among women than men. due to comorbidities. And as Soumya just said, that among hospital workers today, women are much more at risk. 83 to 85% of nurses and midwives in India are female, and they are less likely to get scarce protective gear than doctors, 84% of whom are male, and doctors tend to be higher up in the medical hierarchy. But even if we assume that women survive COVID-19 better due to biological factors, the death of a spouse means widowhood and possibly becoming a female-headed household, which is, and female-headed households, as we know, are much more, face much more risk of poverty. So this is another vulnerable category to watch out for. The fourth, of course, is another fourth framing issue, which we are all familiar with, which is existing inequalities that women face in earning a living. So apart from the unequal domestic work burdens, which Soumya and many others have mentioned, the restricted mobility and limitation of assets, we have segregated labor markets. So on the one hand, this means that women will not be pushed out of certain jobs by men, for instance, domestic maids. But on the other hand, we could expect an overcrowding of jobs that are open to women. For instance, during lockout, some women workers began to make masks, but due to overcrowding in some states, they soon ran short of materials and markets. If we think of the future, we need a sectoral analysis of women's work and expected recovery. Now, we know that the majority of women workers are in agriculture, and it could be argued that agriculture could perhaps survive better than industry and many services which are collapsing. And this may give women some advantage. But again, as many millions of young male migrants return from cities and decide to remain in the villages, agriculture could get overcrowded. So we really have to see and look out for that. And sixthly, and finally, perhaps, we still often focus on workers as atomized individuals, and perhaps not enough on the institutional form within which they work. And a key institutional form is, of course, the collective. Now, in India's experience, and many of you who are attending this webinar are activists and know this very much more than me, that over the past many decades, groups and collectives have had great potential. But of course, collectives can take many forms. They can be trade unions, self-help groups, they can be joint enterprises, associations. Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA, which Renana will speak about, is of course one of the most important examples. But the question is, have groups helped women survive better under lockdown? And will they help revival, in the post-lockdown period? Is there a particular role they can play? In answering this question, however, I feel we need to look beyond collectives which do marketing and saving and credit. As I argue in my recent research on group farming, we have seriously underexplored women's production collectives, where they pool their resources and come together to produce something. Could be farms or any other enterprise. But for now, I will not address that question, but I will address it in the second round of comments. So Soumya, with this, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beenaji. We'll go over to Renana Ben now. Renana Ben, a significant part of India's female workforce, as we know, is actually in the informal, so-called unorganized sector. And SEWA is one of the largest unions representing these poor, self-employed women in the informal economy, not just in India, but in the world. What has been the impact of the lockdown on such women? What are you hearing from your members?
First, Soumya, really appreciate you organizing this webinar, and I'm really happy to see many friends among the participants. So welcome to all the participants, and thank you for organizing it. I am going to sort of depend on a study that Siva has been doing over this is the second round of the study, a kind of longitudinal one. We have interviewed about 760. We have interviewed 760 women, of which 300 are extensive, and the rest are shorter questionnaire. But and basically, we wanted to first find out what is happening to their work, and has everybody else in the economy, work is just shut down. In the urban areas, our members are home-based workers, different types of artisans, street vendors, construction workers, and rag pickers, and almost all domestic workers, and except for a few, very few street vendors who are still selling vegetables, and except for a few, very few home-based workers who are making masks, their work is completely shut down. This survey, by the way, was in 11 states of India, in almost all regions. When we talk to the women, the domestic workers were somewhat hopeful that they would be able to go back to work, but the home-based workers, the construction workers, they weren't sure when their work would start again. The street vendors did think that their markets would open again, but they didn't know when. We thought that the rural areas, there'd be more work, but in fact, that's not so. Narega has not started anywhere that we interviewed. And we found that those people who go to the fields, who are agriculturists, the small farmers, the sharecroppers, first of all, their fields are far from when their fields are far from their homes, they find it difficult to go. And secondly, since they're women, they don't have their own transport. So they've always depended on public transport, and all that is shut down. So they cannot go and buy seeds, they can't go and buy fertilizers, and they're unable to go to the markets. And anyway, most of them sell in the rural huts, and the huts are shut down. Livestock is the most difficult because they are finding it very difficult to feed the cattle. The grazing has completely stopped, so they have to buy feed, and there's no cash. I think that's the work situation. But the biggest situation, of course, the biggest impact is, of course, hunger and lack of cash. And I see that the women are sort of the invisible face of the hunger. The visible face we see in the media, the migrants who are really suffering and who are walking home without food. But the invisible face is the women the migrants have left behind. Their incomes have completely stopped, and they are also not getting enough food. And similarly in the urban areas, and the ones who are most vulnerable, the women, female-headed households, those whose husbands or fathers have not been working, and who were always on the edge of survival. We did look at, we have the government saying that the PDS system will give free food. We did look at how many people were getting free food, and we were rather surprised that only 54% of our sample said that they received free rations. And I sort of matched that with a study that has been done by the Dahlberg consultancy. They did it for the BPL, families, and they had almost similar, 55% have received free food. So what about the others? The others, either they have to buy their food, or they get help from neighbors or from NGOs, or they get cooked food. but there's a real struggle for food. Only 5% was making any income, and only 17% said that they had any savings left. So cash is depleting very rapidly. And they've started borrowing. 78% have started borrowing. Fortunately, they're able to borrow still from community, from family, from relatives. But a small number, 7%, have borrowed from the money lender and are paying 5 to 18%, depending on where they are, per month interest. But even those who have borrowed are very worried because they're worrying about how they can repay. We are seeing, and I was saying hunger, we are seeing because of the lack in cash, there is a real cut in expenditure. Most people have stopped buying vegetables. They buy very little milk or no milk. They've stopped recharging their phones. And especially in the urban areas, they worry about rents. And there's a continuous bargaining going on with the landlords, some of whom are kind and allow them not to pay, and others who harass them. But they still have expenses other than food. They have to buy agricultural supplies, they have to buy medicines, utility bills come, and in the rural areas, they have to buy fodder. We tried to find out whether they were selling their assets. And what they said was, well, there's nobody to buy those assets. They would like to sell the cattle because they're now so expensive to feed, but of course, there's nobody to buy it. The kinds of assets they've sold, only a few, very few have sold assets, but the kinds of assets they sold are selling a phone. They want to sell their household assets like a cycle or an auto rickshaw. Some home-based workers and street vendors both said they had inventory in their houses and they would be happy to sell that, and they were looking for buyers. And so those people who are the small micro entrepreneurs who've built up the capital in form of inventory right now, they're going to lose all that money. That's sort of what we saw. It's a real desperate situation. Both hunger and life is desperate. And so there's a lot of stress in the family, sometimes leading to violence. I'll stop here. And in the second, I'll say about, is there something that we can all do to help?
Thank you so much, Rananaben. This is really insightful, the findings from the survey. To Santoshji, I just wanted to ask you, what would be the one or two policies, in your recent book, you have spoken about India's workforce and economic distress, particularly even before the lockdown started, as well as the positive side, which is its demographic dividend, because India is a young population. In which sectors are women workers concentrated, and how might they be impacted by COVID-19? And in particular, what do you think would be the effect of this lockdown for younger workers, younger women workers?
Thank you so much, Soumya, for inviting me, and thank you to the 272 participants who are listening in. Before I turn to the sectors where women are concentrated and the impact there, let me turn to the very first word that you used, Soumya, which is demographic dividend. And I want to place the COVID pandemic impact on the economy in the broad context of the conjuncture where we stand in terms of the development of the economy. Our demographic dividend, which is defined as a rising share in the working age population, in the total population, and a falling share of dependents in the total population, had begun. The dividend had begun in the early 1980s, and it will end by 2040. It comes but once in the life of a nation. And we are already 2/3 of the way through it. In 2040, it will be over. So, and we were already, before the COVID pandemic, the economy was slowing and had gone back to a rate which prevailed about 15 years earlier. And unemployment was at a 45-year high, according to the PLFS, in 2018. It had tripled between 2012 and 2018. And between 2018 and now, it has tripled again. So we are at a very, very vulnerable state in the economy, and for all families, particularly in the bottom 5 deciles, and of course, for women. Now, just to give you a feel for what was happening in the period from about 2004-5 onwards, something remarkable happened in the education sector. And women were the greatest beneficiaries of that phenomenon. Enrollment rates rose very rapidly, and universal primary enrollment was achieved by 2007. And as a result of that, upper primary enrollment also got universalized in the next few years. And what happened as a result of that was there was upward pressure in the education system. And in 2010, the secondary enrollment for 15 to 16-year-olds was about 58%. In 5 years, it turned to 85% with gender parity. Now, that is a silent revolution that has swept across the whole country, with girls getting educated all the way, most of the girls getting educated all the way up to class 10. And obviously that had upward pressure into the higher secondary and higher education system. But obviously all these people started coming into the labor force. So as the numbers of young people, particularly women, started entering the labor force looking for work, at the same time, the job growth rate actually fell as the economy's growth rate fell. So that's why I began by saying that we already in 2018 had reached a tripling of the unemployment rate. It tripled thereafter again. And in end of April 2020, the open unemployment rate is 27%, which means that over a quarter of the workforce is unemployed. Partly this is because of the lockdown. But since we know that the economy is going to recover only very, very slowly, we have a very long haul ahead. Now, I want to close this part of my introduction by just mentioning a Nandi Foundation survey of girls, teenage girls, 13 to 19-year-olds. In the year 2018, 70,000 girls were interviewed across the country, and they were asked a very interesting question. What age would you like to get married? You know that the legal marriage age for women is 18. And about 25% of them said we want to marry between the ages of 18 and 20. And 51% of them said we want to marry between the ages of 20 and 25. In other words, they have gotten educated. Their aspirations are very different from that of their mothers, and therefore they would want work in the urban areas and in industry and services. So they would want much better livelihoods than their parents have ever had. Let me turn very quickly to which sectors were where the women are concentrated. So of course, we've already mentioned agriculture. Now, I want to sort of say a few words about what was happening to agriculture. One of the very important reasons why the labor force participation rate of women, I know there are measurement issues, but the point really remains that the measurement issues were existing before 2004-5, and they still exist. So, we can abstract away from that. The point is that in agriculture, animal husbandry work, which was done by women, has actually collapsed because common property resources have shrunk over a period of time. Secondly, in the cropping area, winnowing and threshing, which was precisely the activity that women used to be mostly engaged in both winnowing and threshing and cropping, and as well as in animal husbandry, women have been losing work. Now, post-COVID, men have returned, as both the panelists mentioned. So they were women, the older, poorly educated women were getting edged out earlier. They will, get edged out even more now. Second, services. What are the sort of subsectors within services where women are concentrated? Well, in urban areas, in informal sector, of course, we all know domestic services. But I should begin by saying on services that while the number of jobs were actually declining in manufacturing, in services post 2012, the jobs were growing, and women were somewhat beneficiaries of this. In urban areas and in the formal sector, the four sectors where women tend to be concentrated are health, it's already been mentioned, and I think post-COVID, there is potential for expansion for obvious sort of reasons. Secondly, they are heavily concentrated in education at every level. Thirdly, they've been in informal banking. And fourthly, they've been in professional services, HR, hospitality, public relations, customer care, and so on, which have all been growth areas, and that's why better educated women have all benefited from that growth. Thirdly, manufacturing. Well, manufacturing post-2012 actually saw an absolute decline in total in jobs, which is unprecedented in India's history. And the structural adjustment, structural transformation process is actually stalled. Now, where are women concentrated in manufacturing? In the informal sector, well, they are in handloom and textiles, and they are in handicraft. In the organized sector, they are mainly in garments. Now, so they're very much in the relatively labor-intensive sectors. Now, the tragedy is that even before before COVID, manufacturing jobs had actually been falling. And with the decline in the economy and the impact of COVID, particularly jobs will be lost in a bigger way in the informal sector, but also in the organized sector, in much the same way as happened after demonetization. Post-COVID impact on younger women that Soumya was asking me about. Well, one of the ways that older women who were moving out of agriculture, who are always better, more poorly educated, were getting non-agri work was through the expansion of the SHG movement. The NRLM and NABARD SHG support and so on has really grown. And in the post-COVID response, the government's 1.7 lakh, there's additional money for SHGs. As far as younger women is concerned, and I will finish with this, as far as younger women are concerned, well, they face a bleaker future than men. You can see that men face a fairly bleak future. But so if I was a young woman who newly got educated in rural areas, I would use this time to enhance my skills for a time when jobs might begin to grow. In particular, I would say for rural educated girls, the newly educated girls, what the government needs to focus on is cluster-based training at the cluster level. There are 5,500 clusters around the country which offer manufacturing jobs, but the girls are usually not adequately trained because they don't have any vocational education or access to it. So this is a time to build your skills. And the result of all of this on the vulnerable people, obviously the most women particularly, is that poverty is going to rise. My estimate is that poverty was already rising between 2012 and 2018, and it's going to rise even further. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Mehrotra. I'll just go very quickly over a second round, but before I do that, just a small announcement to say that we have disabled the chat because there was somebody trying to hack into the system. We're also trying to delete the chat function, and we're still working on that. But if you have any questions and answers, please use the Q&A support system, which seems to be much more secure for now. I'll just go back to you, Beenaji, and you can take 4 to 5 minutes in this round, which is to say that going forward, now that we know that the challenge at hand, what can be the policy solutions to address the livelihood crisis that women are facing? What do you think that India should do? We all know that for long you have been arguing about group-based approaches. Professor Mehrotra just alluded to it. Do they provide an answer?
Thank you. I just want to pick up one small point prior to that that Santosh raised. I think the issue of animal husbandry is interesting, but probably requires much more probing, because it's a very, very women-oriented occupation in India, but also it's very labor-intensive. From not just looking after animals, collection of fodder. I'm not sure CPRs would be, the collapse of common pool resources would be possible answer, but I think that's been happening for a long time. Whereas aging, where the girl, what you mentioned about girls going to school and not being available to help their mothers in such a labor-intensive occupation, could be something that we might want to look at. Now, I think group-based approaches can make a big difference in women's ability to economically survive COVID-19 and other calamities. Now, Renana, of course, is the best person to talk about Seva and its implications compared to people who are not in Seva. But I want to talk about another type of group which has received rather little policy focus in India and globally, and this is group farming. Now, we know that in the 2017-18 labor force survey, women constituted about 30% of farm workers, and 73% of rural women workers are still in agriculture. But most rural women work on family farms as unpaid workers or as farm labor at low pay. And in most states, less than 10% of women in land-owning households own land. So there is also a huge gender gap in access to technology, to information, to inputs, which really puts women farmers at a huge disadvantage. So is there an alternative? And I believe there is an alternative, which is what I'm going to talk about, and that alternative lies in group farming. And what do I mean by that? By that I mean that women might pool their land, labor, and financial resources and share the costs and benefits. Now, conceptually, we could argue that this can bring scale economies. It can save on hired labor. It can also enhance women's ability to deliver on contracts and increase their bargaining power in markets. Now, you might say, well, all that is fine in theory, but what is the situation in practice? And I believe there is a significant success story from Kerala, which I've researched in depth. And it's linked to also their ability to survive during the period of lockdown. So in 1998, just by way of background, Kerala launched its Kudumshri mission, which is the state poverty eradication mission. But unlike other states, where anti-poverty programs were much more directed to individuals, Kerala set in place an institutional structure for promoting all women group enterprises. They're located at the village level within neighborhood groups, which are also saving and credit groups, and scaled up to the village panchayat level through the Kudumshri network. Now, one of the most important group enterprises, among the others, was all women's group farming, in which about 4 to 10 women come together and they jointly lease in land, because rather few own land, but they can lease in land from within the group too, pool their labor and resources, and they share all costs and returns. Now, to assess the economic performance, I had collected very detailed data on the inputs and outputs in 2 districts for a sample of group farms and in comparison of individual family farms, 95% of which were male managed. And I found that the groups had 1.8 times the annual value of output per hectare and 5 times the net returns per farm relative to the individual farmers. Now, the details I won't go into in this short time, but I have a World Development paper on this, which in 2018. But what is the situation today? Now, today there are over 68,000 such groups, and they cover all the 14 districts of Kerala. And by Kudumshree's assessment, most of these groups have survived through the COVID-19 lockdown. And so, for instance, a fair proportion of them who were cultivating crops in the winter crop, they didn't face the kind of labor problem that Renana had mentioned in her survey, because the group itself with small plots, could cultivate, could use their own labor. And they didn't face the marketing problems because they sold the crops locally, and they also got state support. So according to that assessment, something like 87% of 31,000 GLGs survived. Now, what is also, I think, a good contrast is that the vegetable growers among them sold or gave their produce to the thousands of women community kitchens, women-run community kitchens, which Kerala had set up. And this is really in contrast to vegetable farmers in other states, where we know that we have all these images of people dumping their produce or sitting in great despair because the produce vegetables have gone bad. Because they could neither harvest, they didn't have the labor, nor could they travel to the markets. But also what is striking is that even in Kerala, a small study that Kudumshree itself had done showed that group enterprises such as bakeries, tailoring, etc., did take a hit, not dissimilar to what the Seva study shows. But most of Kerala's group farms pulled through. And I also want to add that Kerala's better performance and ability to respond to the COVID crisis in general compared to other states is really rooted especially in its long-term investment in institutions. Now, this would include their very effective decentralized governance. All of India decentralized, but they've been particularly effective. They have a vast Kudumshree network of women's groups. They have universal traditional healthcare systems and very early investment in girls' education. So 92% of women are literate. And that makes obviously any messaging for COVID-19 that much easier. So, what I'm trying to say is that although yes, we talk about SHGs as a potential model and could put SHG to group enterprises, they can, and I think that's really worth exploring in more detail. But it also has to be backed up by other institutional structures, which go beyond SHG federations, for instance. So people do ask, well, is Kerala unique? Is the experience replicable? And I believe it is, but it will require well-designed institutions and a strong state commitment. And so state capacity is, of course, a key factor, and a whole history of institution building, which I think we need to recognize. So I'll stop there, Soumya.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Rinanaben, over to you. Given that Seva works so much with women in the informal economy, what would be the 1 or 2 policy options that India should pursue to provide, some measure of resilience and sustainability to such women post the lockdown?
I'd like to actually say something about also during the lockdown, because the lockdown, it may be lifted, but it will be slow, it will be in phases and so on. So this issue of hunger and of food of critical importance, both the food and the cash. I would say that the government really needs to give, to ensure that food is distributed to everyone, regardless of whether they have a ration card or not. And to really, really step up the distribution of food through the ration shops, but also through other means. There are some very good examples where government has worked with local communities and non-government organizations to actually reach out within communities and get food to everyone. And secondly, the food that they're giving out now is often just grains, sometimes not even atta. And what they need to give out is a much better food package, which includes lentils, grains, lentils, sugar, tea. So there needs to be a very good ration kit that needs to go out, and it needs to go out immediately. The other thing that does need to go out immediately, and for which a package really needs to be developed, is emergency, a sort of an emergency basic income, a cash transfer on a one-time or two-time basis. A lot of women we talked to had got the Jandhan 500 rupees, but as you can imagine, 500 rupees is very little, and it's important to give them something a little more substantial. So I think during this period, that's a very important thing that needs to be done. Going back to work, I think there are a few things that I'd like to highlight. As I said, that domestic workers do feel that they will be able to go back to work. So will farmers when the markets open up and when they can move around. But those who are manufacturing at home, all kinds of home-based workers, they're usually in a market which is a bit more, which may be considered a luxury item. They're weavers, embroidery workers, they're garment workers, and they worry that the market will not open up. And so that they're a group which needs very special attention. And there are many big suppliers who can reach out to these home-based workers and give them work once the markets open up. I'd also like to talk about what is happening to the self-employed, the micro-entrepreneurs. As I mentioned earlier, they're losing all their liquidity. So any capital, for any little enterprise to work, you need to build up capital. So any capital they have built up, they now are using in consumption for their families. So in a way, we need to find schemes to recapitalize these micro entrepreneurs. And that can be done through two ways. One is just a cash subsidy. And I think that's important, that we just give them a certain amount of money so they recapitalize. And the other is through loans. And I'd like to piggyback on what Beena said, which is that many of these small micro entrepreneurs have already formed groups, whether they're self-help groups or they're FPOs, that is farmer producer organizations, SHG federations, or they're cooperatives. And if in order to channel these cash subsidies and these loans to the micro entrepreneurs, these are the formats that can be used and should be used. And so policies, I think since micro entrepreneurs are by far the largest number, they need to think of a special scheme for these micro entrepreneurs. That's, I think, what we were able to think about as the economy begins to open. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nanaben. Santoshji, also now, given your insights from the book and also your recent article in the print on the MSME sector, where a lot of women are concentrated, what policy options do you think India should pursue now? You had given 4 to the Modi government overall for the MSME sector, but what policy options do you think India should pursue specifically for improving employment prospects for women?
Right. Let me first begin by endorsing a point that both Bina as well as Renana Ben made um, about group work. And for the older, poorly educated women, I think there's an absolute essential that there has to be more money going into SHGs in the short run. The second thing I want to underline is the minimum income guarantee, the cash transfer that Renana Ben in particular talked about. And I should tell you that I've just recently finished a paper which actually does a design of what could be a way forward for the government. In other words, how could 60% of rural households and 46% of urban households be covered? This is sort of and a design which is very feasible, also fiscally feasible, because it would cost no more than what PM Kisan costs, and yet it would be much more inclusive than PM Kisan. In fact, it could cost nothing at all if PM Kisan would be subsumed within it, and in fact, PM Kisan could be done away with. So let me move from those to specifically talking about what is essential from the perspective of women, and I will just make 3 sets of points. The first is about encouraging women's entrepreneurship, because all these young women who've gotten better educated and their expectations are in for working not in agriculture. Their expectations are that they will not necessarily want to do want to be part of SHGs, though they can play a role in SHGs as well as the people who keep the accounts and so on. But the point is that their aspirations are very different, and it's almost certain that with better levels of education, it is not surprising. So one is that only 13% of all the 63 million enterprises that exist in our country are women-owned units, and majority of them are actually own account units. So it's absolutely critical that there has to be a support for women's entrepreneurship. Secondly, for urban women in particular, the food sector, food processing is a highly labor-intensive activity, and education. These are regarded as the top 2 sectors for urban women. And for instance, these are expected to the GVA is supposed to rise by 800 crores and by 300 crores by 2025 in food and education. So what are the high potential ideas in this space for entrepreneurship? Well, in respect of food, home snacks, cloud-based kitchens, organic food, artisanal food, ready-to-cook foods. And in the education sector, well, education tech-enabled home tutoring, scaling independent daycares, franchise models for competitive exam tutoring, looking at exclusively to the area of entrepreneurship. But more in the area of social services, well, there's critical need for the government to expand expenditure on health. That's a requirement post-COVID. In any case, it's a highly labor-intensive activity. I already said that women are highly concentrated there. Paramedic staff, ASHAs, Anganwadi workers. We need to, I'll come back to this in a minute, midwives, similarly for education. And, JPAL research also shows that programs that reduce job search barriers improve job seekers' employment outcomes. So for instance, there's a study in India which shows that giving villagers information about city-based BPO jobs for women and offering placement services increase the chances that young women could actually work. And finally, let me turn to the well-known area of ensuring better childcare, affordable working girls' hostels in towns, and better public transportation for women. I mean, we know very well that if you look at the global gender index for 2014, for instance, of 142 countries, it shows that India has the highest difference between men and women on average minutes spent per day on unpaid work, as much as 300 minutes, 6 hours. It's the highest in the world. And what we need is affordable, better childcare. And ICDS centers currently work for only 3 or 4 hours. If they were to run for 6 or 7 hours, then perhaps the 0 to 6-year-old children could stay for longer and women could find work outside of the home. Similarly, affordable childcare for school-going children, urban and particularly in urban areas. Urban Anganwadis may have to expand their scope, perhaps. Secondly, the Ministry of Women and Child Development could start building affordable hostels for girls who are looking for work in towns. And finally, of course, public transportation. Delhi has already made it free for women, more buses. All of this would actually enable women participating in the labor force, going out to look for work. The Delhi evidence is already very good at this. Let me close by just saying that the scenario is very grim. Just as the young women have begun to enter the labor force looking for non-agri work, precisely then the number of jobs being created in the non-agri sector began to fall. And this is very, very damaging to the hopes and aspirations of these women who are obviously have high expectations of getting into non-agri jobs in urban areas. Because open unemployment rates actually doubled or tripled. The higher your education level, the higher the unemployment rates. You would be surprised to know that if you're a graduate, it went from 19% to 36% between 2012 and 2018. Can you imagine how much more it would rise now? If you're a postgraduate, it went from 21% to 36%. If you were just vocationally educated, it went from 18% to 33%. You can imagine, this is 2018, you can imagine what the implications of COVID and the impact on the economy are going to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mehrotra. This is very insightful. So we have 2 ways of doing this. I can actually invite the participants to ask the questions themselves. I'm a little hesitant because of all the hacking that's going on. So, we've asked them to actually write down their questions in the Q&A question post. So if you don't mind, I'll just read them out, and I have the names of the people who asked them, and extremely apologetic to the participants. We would have liked to get you into the meeting, but just at the risk of the remaining 20-25 minutes being hacked. So there are some questions that are specific to the panelists, and there are some that are more general. I think I'll start reading the more general ones first, so that all 3 of you can perhaps come in. Should I read about a few questions, 3 or 4 questions, and then maybe we can ask all of you to start speaking? Okay. So there is one that has come in from Sejal Dand, who's actually working. Anandi is actually a partner for one of our interventions, iWages interventions. I'll just pull it up. I can't seem to actually see her question again. Sejal, can you again post it if possible, if you're hearing me? Because it was an interesting question around Narega. There's one question that has come in on actually strengthening the policies around the PDS, because there seems to be a lot of difficulties in food distribution. So what should be done? This is a question from Priya Gupta. What should be done to ensure that there are quality food grains that are being distributed? There is one question from Penny Vera Sanso that is specifically for Professor Mehrotra. And it says, can you talk about older women, particularly over the age of 60, and how are they engaging in agriculture and the informal sector? For Professor Agarwal, there is a question from Asha Ramesh on whether she thinks that NRLM can also promote group farming pan-India. The CIF could be invested to either purchase land or lease land for this farming. And don't you think this will take care of food security, and surplus could also serve local consumption? So the domestic market could be run by the non-farming women. And then there is a question from Kalpana Pant, who's also a partner for iWage. She runs Chaitanya, which is an NGO looking at women's federations in Maharashtra and now in Chhattisgarh. And she says, isn't higher education also a reason for non-employment of women, especially in urban areas? Does it now serve as a gender barrier? So I'll just close with 4 questions for now, and then we can come back.
Okay.
Beenaji, you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for those questions. I think one, I want to, before I take the very specific question that Asha has posed to me, I do want to say that I'm not as pessimistic as Santosh is about younger women not wanting to engage in agriculture. I think a lot of people think of agriculture as dirtying your hands, low tech. But what is interesting is that there have been some new emergence of group farming in North Bengal and Bihar, where which areas that I have visited. And what you find is that young men have returned back in some cases from the cities because they have now drip irrigation, they do vegetable farming, and there are markets nearby. So they don't see it, they see farming in a slightly different way. And I was thinking that it's still a possibility to explore whether young men and women, if they begin to see farming as a business, as much more technology, higher technology driven, the perception about it might change. And especially if there's a group of them with different skills. The second is also relatedly, in the health sector, we know that we hope that a positive that could come out is a great demand for improving our health services in India. And among a number of younger women, this is completely anecdotal, you find that, nursing has become an important aspirational option. Now we need to get more figures on the rising demand for nursing, but a lot of nursing hospitals and institutions have opened up. And this is again, trying to see whether those sectors which are expanding could be something that younger women might take advantage of. So the specific question on Asha, by Asha, Asha, I want to be quite cautious about how we expand group farming because in fact, although I spoke about Kerala's success story, I'd also looked at Telangana, where there had been a significant experiment in group farming. And it didn't work as well as Kerala's did. And I have compared why and asked why. And part of it is that other institutional structures weren't there in place. The state support system, the kind of neighborhood groups to the community development societies which Kerala has registered, which give them autonomy vis-a-vis both the government and the panchayats. So it is replicable, but I think these other institutional structures need to be in place. Also, it's very interesting that, for instance, paddy farmers in Kerala have a Padishekra Samiti, and some of the rice was purchased by them when they couldn't themselves directly transport the rice. So you need not just SHGs doing group farming, but you also need to build support institutional structures. And the second, on the issue of purchase, and I don't think somebody should get in from outside and purchase land. You'll just have a skyrocketing of land prices. Firstly, land is not easily available for sale. Most people don't want to sell their land. Land markets are not very active in India in that respect. You don't want the government or any such agency to do that. I think it's much more important that when the groups form, they have a means of negotiating access to land. And again, it's very interesting that in the much more feudal region of Bihar, and where the groups that I've looked at are forming, they are able to actually negotiate rents with landlords. So some of the difficulties which Renana mentioned about landlords troubling you find that in fact as a group they were much more able to bargain better to lower the rents. I think it's very important. Need to do it with caution.
Renana Ben?
Thank you.
Thank you, Binaji.
Okay, so let me actually read out Sejal's question, since you were going to do it. So what Sejal has written is, can 100 additional days for rural women under NREGA be considered? Can work on vegetable plots, RRWHS, SRI, vermicompost pits, etc. be added to the activities for small and marginal farmers? So I think what you're suggesting is that as maybe even before the lockdown opens, you really expand NREGA, and when the lockdown opens, then you make sure that it runs. And it's a very good idea. But I would like to also say something controversial, which is that my own feeling has always been that we have the list of NREGA women and men, of course, and we also have their account numbers. I would really recommend a pure cash transfer, a sort of basic income to all those people or throughout the year. So expanding NREGA is one idea, and the cash transfers to all of them is another one, since those lists already exist. About the food, I really don't have much to say on the quality, but what I would like to say is on ration cards, that especially for migrant workers who go to other states or go to urban areas, they have very great difficulty getting ration cards. And anyway, they already have ration cards in their villages. So the portability of ration cards is a very important issue. And I think that is something that really needs to be taken up, the portability, so that we don't have the kind of situation that we got with migrants starving. Okay, that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Renana Ben. Santoshji?
Yeah, let me make 3 sets of points. So, first of all, of course, I very, very much endorse the group farming idea that Veena has been talking about, but we must keep in mind the following fact, that all the way until 2004, from independence onwards, the absolute number of workers in agriculture had been rising. For the first time in India's post-independence history, post-2004, the absolute number of workers in agriculture has been falling, which is the appropriate Lewisian transition that needs to happen. And that has tended to slow down. If the girls' brothers don't want to be in agriculture, if their parents don't want to be in agriculture, then it's a bit unlikely that the girls would want to be in agriculture. I'm not for a moment suggesting, Beena, that we shouldn't uh, support group farming. In fact, I in my own written work, I have sort of at least 3 papers on labor force participation in world development and EPW and in Premji's side, where I make the argument not dissimilar from yours that if women have moved, have been edged out of agriculture, and if agriculture is becoming mechanized, slightly more high tech, then there is nothing to prevent women from being trained to actually do the somewhat more running the tractor or running the winnowing of the threshing machine, etc. My second point is about older women. You see, between the period 1996 to 2004, when agricultural output was stagnating, and real wages had been stagnant for a full 8 years, what you found was that 20 million women joined agriculture, and along with them, over 60-year-olds also joined, because there was serious rural distress. After 2004, the agricultural growth rate improved, and as incomes rose, because the labor market in rural areas tightened, partly on account of Manrega, but more importantly on account of construction jobs, non-agri jobs growing very fast in urban areas, the labor market tightened, so real wages rose. They had been stagnant for an 8-year period until 2004. They consistently rose between 2004, 5, and 11, 12. Unfortunately, post-2012, they've actually stagnated, or they've actually fallen, real wages. So that's why I was suggesting that that incomes would have stagnated. And in that situation, while in the period 4, 5 to 11, 12, older women came out of, agriculture, in this period that, I haven't looked at this, but this is really quite sad. The question was put to me about higher education proving to be a barrier. Yes and no. Because it is clearly what is true is that between 2012 and 2018, open unemployment rates rose, especially for youth. The higher your education level, the higher the unemployment rate, and obviously women are going to be edged out from that. But it's also true that, as I was saying, and at least in absolute terms, women were finding work in a whole series of urban and my final point, let me just refer to this debate between Manrega and cash transfer. On Sejal's suggestion about additional 100 days, let's just remind ourselves that on average, never since about 2005 in Manrega have the average person days for a household been more than 53. Yes, of course, when you reach a household reaches 100, you could, in this context, actually increase the number. You could relax that. The problem is that at least post-COVID in April, there was a dramatic fall in the number of person days actually generated because there was no work happening. So honestly, in the last analysis, I would still reinforce the argument that Renana Ben was making about cash transfer, because you see, suppose we had a pipeline already pre-COVID and a well-institutionalized system of cash transfer. Then when a crisis like this comes, then you can actually increase the amount that you pump into the household. It's perfect. It's so easy to do. But we don't have an architecture just now, and that architecture can be put in place because the 3 preconditions for actually having in place a minimum income guarantee through a cash transfer are all in place. Now, I won't go into that. I've just written a paper. Anyone who's interested can see my soon-to-be published career working occasional paper.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Beenaji, yes.
I think, I would really support what Renana and Santosh have been saying, but there's some, some recent work. It's just one of those studies, a rapid study during COVID, lockdown that Rohini Pandey and her group did, where they talked about only 50% of the poor women received, the cash transfers through the Pradhan Mantri scheme, and that was because of the problems they had with not having accounts. So I think that that's something I want to ask. And the second was this issue about urban Narega. And that's one of the issues. What is the possibility of having Narega in urban areas? Not immediately, of course, but I think it's something that we might think about. I do want to mention that in some states, Narega was actually been used to allow poor farmers to prepare their land. So for certain operations. So, for instance, in Kerala, the women could actually prepare the land and declare themselves as Narega workers legally, and therefore get paid for it. So I think that was an interesting interactive effect of Narega with self-cultivation in small farms, and that's again something which can be expanded to other states. If using Asha Ramesh's term, it could be thought of on a pan India basis.
So we have just, thank you, Binaji. We just have 2 minutes left. What I can do is, if everybody has time and is still interested, we can go on for another 5 to 7 minutes. And there are already still about 50 open questions. So I don't think we'll have time. What we are doing is compiling a list of questions as circulated around to the panelists at a later stage, just to spark our collective thinking. And I'll just pose 2 or 3 other very interesting questions that have been coming up, and maybe we could just go on for another 5-7 minutes if it's okay with you. There's one which is a recurring question on migrant women. So who are these migrant women? Where are they working? What is the portability of benefits that we are talking about? How is it different for migrant women who are working in the cities? Then there is an issue of, adolescent girls. Actually, now that there is a lot of stress on the family income, would adolescent girls drop out of school? Because then they would be the first ones to be pulled out over and above the boys. And then there's just one more, which was very interesting. Yes, there's one issue that's coming up is the issue of intersectionality. So do we take women as one collective group? Or, of course, there are women who are Dalit women, who are Muslim women, who may, of course, further be disadvantaged. And we're seeing that now coming up, from the ground level insights that we are receiving. And what should be the measures that you should specially target towards these particularly vulnerable women from these groups? I'll stop there. Rinanaben, you want to go first?
No, if you don't mind, let me just digest what you asked.
Okay. Binaji?
Okay, I'll have a go. Just we have little time. The relationship of adolescent girls with the current situation, I think it could be mixed. If you don't have very much in terms of an occupation within the household, and at least up to a point, education is free, there is no reason why you should pull adolescent girls out. I mean, you would pull them out if their presence in the home would help you to generate income. But if not, then why would you want to pull them out, especially if midday meals and etc. are involved. So I think the effect could be quite much more complex. I completely agree about intersectionality. It's very, very important. And in fact, when we collect information, although we haven't nuanced our discussion, but but certainly it's implicit when all of us were talking and we talked about cash transfers, Narega. It was obviously to the poorest category of households and poorest women, because middle class women were not going to go and do Narega in that sense. But I think on Dalits, it's an alert. It's to recognize certain religious communities, Dalits, how are they being affected. I did want to share, and this is just that I was looking at some of the literature on the 1918 pandemic, and what was very striking was that the mortality rate among Dalits was hugely higher in Bombay city compared to caste Hindus and others, and we don't have any breakdown at this point, a proper breakdown of what's happening in India on that count. But if you're undernourished, you're poor, you're much more susceptible to the virus, and you're much more susceptible. Comorbidities are not just about having a heart condition, it's also about anemia, it's also about all the other aspects that we know women suffer from across the board, but particularly if you're poor, you're Dalit, and so on. So I think that's a very important reminder on how we should we should evaluate what's happening and assess it. Thank you.
Thank you, Beenaji. Santoshji,
3 points.
would you want to go? Yeah.
Yeah, 3 points. One, on urban Manrega. In fact, there's a whole chapter in our new book, Reviving Growth, Reviving Jobs and Agenda for Growth on this, and we actually present a chapter. Amit Basole and his team from Azim Premji University presented design for that, and I think that time has come for us to actually begin that. It'll be absolutely critical. Secondly, on the issues that Beena was raising about cash transfers, let me just add that it's no one's case that all will be hunky-dory with cash transfers unless a few issues are resolved in advance, and it's absolutely critical that this is done through a pilot. But what are the issues that need to be resolved? That every bank account has to be Aadhaar seeded. Not all bank accounts are Aadhaar seeded. If they are not Aadhaar seeded, then you cannot discover potential ghost beneficiaries, because there is a risk that a certain household may have multiple bank accounts. So you need to sort of filter out people. Secondly, there are, despite the fact that it is claimed that the country now has 99.9% coverage of households with bank accounts, there are still plenty of households which are likely to be without. So we have to make sure that happens. So there are clearly many issues that have to be resolved before we are going to do this. And it's absolutely critical that if a cash transfer is going to be put in place, it must be first piloted like the Chinese always do. Everywhere the Chinese pilot before they go to scale. It's not that IS officers get together in an air-conditioned room and design a program for a whole country and then roll it out for the whole country all in one go. So my third point is about the invisible migrant worker, including the migrant women. This invisibility is something which the male migrant suffers from as much as a female migrant suffers. As we have already seen, the invisibility for everyone, including the data collectors as well as the policymakers. Now, one of the things that I've been doing for the last week actually is preparing a response to the Standing Committee on Labour of the Parliament, which is currently looking at a draft code on social security. Now, what's interesting is that while it's very good news that this draft code actually talks about the need for registering all units, all establishments, fantastic. But what about registering all the workers? In other words, put the responsibility of registering all the workers along with registering the employers, and put the responsibility on the employer. That way you don't separate this out. In other words, you make sure that this invisibilization disappears once and for all, and you make those benefits that might flow from a social security for an organized sector actually portable, which requires a certain card which that worker carries around, whether it's a man or a woman, around the country wherever he or she may go, the migrant worker.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mehrotra. Renanabin?
Yeah, I'd like to first talk about intersectionality. And what you'll see is that the kinds of work that people do is often very much connected with their caste and their religion. So you will find a much higher percentage of agriculture workers who are scheduled caste. You'll find that a much higher percentage of home-based workers among Muslim women, they would be more home-based workers than others. So often the intersectionality can also be dealt with by looking at the kind of work that they're doing, or focusing on the work that those particular people are doing. The other thing I also wanted to point out, which is especially in the COVID context, and just picking up from what Beena said about scheduled caste people and getting more affected in pandemics. And part of the reason for that is that if you look at who in the urban areas, who lives in the informal settlements, in the slums, with very little water and very little, and shared toilets and not very clean toilets. So that again is very caste oriented. So I think those are the means by which one needs to focus in on intersectionality, by looking at where they're living, where they're working, and addressing those issues. I also agree that I don't think after this adolescent girls are going to be pulled out of work. I don't think that is going to happen, because there is a huge, I'm sorry, out of school. Because there is a huge wave of people wanting to educate the girls and girls wanting to be educated. So as much as they can afford it, I may be a general decline in schooling because people can't afford it anymore. I mean, not necessarily girls as opposed to boys. And just the last thing on this cash transfers, yes, our system, I mean, we can have systems which work. There's also the issues about the reach of the banks. And one of the ways that banks could reach out is through the banking correspondence, but mostly the banks are not doing that very well. But you could have one banking correspondent per village if the banks really worked on that. So if there was a real desire to reach cash transfers to people, then I think these issues of actually reaching them, the issues of distribution, could be worked out, because now we do have the means to do that.
I just wanted to mention that, the migrant women question, that it's, you're right, we don't really know fully, but many of them could be construction workers. If you see, some of them have young children, and for construction work, sometimes entire families migrate. Although we do need much more information in general, I mean, of making the migrants much more visible, but that could be one possible explanation of who the women are in these groups which are walking back.
Okay, thank you all so much. I think in terms of next steps, we will of course save the question and answers, because they've just the extraordinary in terms of the ideas that have come forth, and we can circulate it to the panelists and of course to other fora as well. The cash transfer debate, of course, is an unending one. Just to add one anecdote is that pensions, elderly pensions in Haryana, and I don't know the current status, but they were distributed in cash. And it worked very well because a lorry would come with cash and it would be distributed in front of the panchayat. And there was no banking correspondence needed, no bank network needed. And this was the government of Haryana distributing elderly and widow pensions to its pensioners. So there are models that one can actually debate about and think about. I just wanted to really thank my panelists. It's been a lovely ride with you, I must say, for the past 1 week as we try and traverse technology issues. It's and I think the heartening thing is that one keeps thinking about dissemination events and trying to have 200 plus people in the room. We managed to do that and have people in their living rooms at the same time. So it's really interesting, and it's a testimony to all the wonderful research and work that our three panelists have put in over the years. I'm really thankful and grateful. And at the end, I just would like to thank my IWH team for the wonderful support that they have come forth with. And this particular webinar will be available on our website, the entire video recording. And we will be back soon with more interesting issues and with more panelists. So thank you so much for joining, and thank you, Professor Mehrotra. Thank you, Binaji and Rinana Ben. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Soumya. I just wanted to say that there is a whole series of. I was just scrolling through the Q&A, and I found there were specific questions addressed to individual panelists. So feel free to share, consolidate those and share them with us.
Sure.
So that we also get a sense of what was being asked and we were not able to address. Right. And even when we get the time, we'll try and answer them to give you an answer, give you the answer, and you can pass it on to others.
That would be.
Or if they have emails and you want to consolidate, you can.
Sure. And
may I just mention one thing, because it's been bothering me a little bit, is that on pensions, we could have, like as I mentioned, widowhood could be when more men die from COVID infections. You could have COVID widows, and they could be particularly vulnerable. Now, the amount that they've increased in widows' pensions is so little that it's really not even worth talking about. And I think, again, this is an alert that we really need to pay attention to this, particularly vulnerable group. Thank you.
Rinanaben, thank you, Binaji. Rinanaben, I just wanted to add, there's a lot of interest in the phone survey that you have done with the SEWA members. I saw you responding to a lot of the questions that had come up. So we're looking forward to seeing it on the Seva Bharat website soon.
Okay, sure. And for people who asked, I've sent them the link.
Yes. Okay, thank you all so much, and we'll be back soon with more webinars.
Thank you so much, Soumya.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much to all the participants for being there so patiently till the end of the meeting. Thank you all. Thank you.
From us as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Keep safe.
Bye-bye.